Smith buck. And this is a picture of me when I was just a little shaver, so you can pass that around. And then my tombstone is over there along with my wife's, and my claim to fame is that I was born in 1812, which is no claim to fame, but I don't have to tell you what famous event in American history has the year 1812 in it. And then I lived until 1892. I was a pioneer settler, an author, and most what I'm known for is historian. Thank you. I moved to Milwaukee in 1837, and I lived here for the rest of my life. I was one of the first group of settlers that came to Milwaukee, and settlers started coming in 1836. So I came the following year, and I came from the East Coast. I had actually planned a different type of life than what I ended up doing here. I was born in Lyman, New Hampshire in 1812, as I mentioned, and when I died in 1892, I was 79 years old. I married Maria Jane Adams, and that was in 1839, and we had 5 children, and they are buried over there. So my start was in Boston, and I was trained as a seaman, and I had actually traveled to Calcutta the year before I heard about this place called Milwaukee. So I decided that I would live a life away from the sea. And the reason for that was because I always had a dream of visiting this land that was way to the west, and it was kind of a fantasy of mine that I had since I was a child. But when I got to Milwaukee, I initially was a building contractor, and I built a lot of the city's earliest buildings, none of which survived because at the time they were wood, and as with most early buildings, they burned. And we were not building out of bricks and mortar yet, so that's another reason why none of those survived. I was a founder of the Milwaukee Old Settlers Club. That was Milwaukee's first historical society, and it was formed during the 1860s when us old-timers got together and thought, we really need to preserve our history because we noticed a lot of our numbers were passing on. So we wanted to not only preserve, but we were social people too. So we wanted this social organization for picnics and get-togethers, and we'd have an annual dinner. And so what we did was to form the Old Settlers Club on July 5th, 1869. That was our first meeting, and we invited anyone who had come to Milwaukee prior to 1839 to join us. We collected books, pictures, and relics of early Milwaukee. And if I mention some of these names of the members, you will recognize right away who they are. Increase Lapham, John Dousman. Now, he's here today. I don't know if you've seen him yet. I'm not sure where he is, but he is here. Alexander Mitchell, Elijah Estes, the Chase brothers from Bayview, or who ended up in Bayview, both Horace and Dr. Enoch Chase, and Uriel B. Smith, who was Milwaukee's first tailor, and he and his wife had the first non-Native American child to be born in Milwaukee, and they appropriately enough named her Milwaukee Smith. Here is a picture of the program of the Old Settlers Club annual dinner. You can pass that around. That's from 1916. So as I mentioned, I was an author, and I became an author as a result of the Old Settlers Club. They asked me to write the history of Milwaukee, so I wrote 4 volumes of that from 1876 to 1886, and it's filled with pioneer biographies, Milwaukee history, and reminiscences. And then I also wrote another book called Milwaukee Under the Charter. That was between 1884 and 1886. And these are still recognized as valuable sources of Milwaukee's early history. Now this is volume 1 of my pioneer history of Milwaukee, and it was published in 1876, but it is still available today. So it is still in print, which I think is amazing. And from what I understand, it's available on Amazon, whatever that is that you people have today. But I'm suggesting that if this Amazon lady tells you to buy this book, you better listen to her, because I wouldn't want to get into a tussle with an Amazon. So here's her review. She says, "This work has been selected by scholars as being culturally important and is part of the knowledge base of civilization as we know it. This work was reproduced from the original artifact and remains as true to the original work as possible. Scholars believe, and we concur, that this work is important enough to be preserved, reproduced, and made generally available to the public. We appreciate your support of the preservation process, and thank you for being an important part of keeping this knowledge alive and relevant." So a lot of times I know that people say, wouldn't it have been great to be a fly on the wall? Well, I was that fly on the wall, and I wrote down all of that history and all of the things that I was personally a witness to. So, as I mentioned, I wrote my books at the request of the Old Settlers Club, and it described the original topography of Milwaukee, because you know that much of Milwaukee was built on swamp, and it was just hills, and it was all pretty much leveled. If you look at the Menominee Valley today, that's not the way it looked when we first arrived here. And there were none of these fancy machines that all of you have nowadays. Everything was moved one bucket of dirt at a time, using the labor of people and animals in order to level all of that. So the book describes what that was like when it was in a state of nature before its development. And the way I got interested in all of this was as a youngster of 7 years old. I saw my first atlas and my first geography book. And there was a map of the United States, and it showed the Northwest Territories. And the Northwest Territories, as you'll recall from your history class, is or was the portion of the United States which at that time was east of the Mississippi River and north of the Ohio River. And out of that Northwest Territories was eventually carved the states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And to me, it was as much of an unknown territory as the moon was. And at the time, it just seemed so out of reach of civilization. And we figured it was going to remain so, at least during our lifetime. And we heard that it was filled with savage beasts and savage men. And little did I expect that the area would become my home, although I often wished that it could be. And just the fact that it was almost an impossibility, that lent a lot of enchantment to this fantasy of mine. But my youthful wish came true due to the rapidity with which civilization advanced in this area in the 40 years between 1836 and 1876 when I started to write my history. And what a change that was. I know that you're familiar with a lot of the things that I describe in my book. I mention the feuding that took place between Byron Kilbourne and Solomon Juno, which kind of culminated in the Bridge Wars. And of course, you all know that's the reason why in the downtown area where the Milwaukee River goes through, those streets don't match up, and you have to go on an angle at streets like Wisconsin Avenue and Wells Street. So that feud went on for a long time. And then there were all of the problems that were accompanying all of the animals that roamed through downtown Milwaukee. At that time, there were as many residential buildings in downtown Milwaukee as there were businesses. And people let their animals roam because they didn't want to fence them in. And it got to be a health problem, and finally in 1859, the city of Milwaukee came up with an ordinance that banned animals from running the streets. And another thing that you may, and of course, what goes along with that is horses. All I have to do is mention, when you go to a parade and you see a couple horses and they have to have people following them. Well, just imagine if everybody has a horse, and that's how your commerce goes around. There's a lot of cleanup, and there's a lot of health problems that go along with that, because it ends up in the rivers and the lakes, and that's why we had these health crises in the late 19th century before we had a sewage treatment plant and all of the other health aspects that go along with it. But there's also the Rock River Canal project, which was Byron Kilbourne's dream. And of course, he was one of Milwaukee's 3 founders: Solomon Juneau, Byron Kilbourne, who I already mentioned, and then George Walker. And Byron Kilbourne was the most innovative and probably had the highest motivation of any of them. And he built railroads, and he also had this dream of a canal, and it was to be the Rock River Canal that would connect Milwaukee with the Mississippi River. And it was to run parallel to the Milwaukee River from North Avenue, and then it would join the Menominee River. And then it would follow the Menominee River west to the Rock River, where it would continue west through the 4 lakes around Madison, and then on to the Mississippi River. And his push for that canal began in 1836, but there was opposition. And I see that today nothing has changed. Most things are still very political. And back in that day, it was very political with that canal. And there were actually political parties that were formed. There were the Canals and there were the anti-canals, or Kilbourne and Sweet. And Sweet was Alanson Sweet, who was the leader of the opposition. And these were backers of the Fox Wisconsin River Improvement Company, which wanted a canal that ran between Green Bay and the Mississippi River. So there was that feud which went on, and the Rock River Canal actually was started but never completed. And it was very interesting what happened with that during the groundbreaking. So I thought I would read you an excerpt from my book, because I like to quote myself. It adds spice to my talks and conversation. So this is about the groundbreaking for the canal. So this was in 1839, and it says that this took place at Kilbourne Town on the 4th of July for the opening of Mr. Kilbourne's famous Milwaukee and Rock River Canal. So he had been granted a charter for that the previous year. So there was a lot of fanfare that went along with this. So when the eventful day came, a procession was formed at Chestnut Street at the corner of 3rd Street. And that was headed by a brass band, from whence they marched to the place selected, which was upon the triangular piece of land lying between 3rd and Cherry Streets, and west of the present canal, just south of Cherry Street. When the precise spot had been selected upon which the incision was to be made, Mr. Kilbourne at once placed himself upon it. His first assistant, the spade holder and chief barrow knight, as in wheelbarrow, who was standing next to him. The implement first selected with which to perform this important ceremony was a common grain scoop. Why, I cannot say, unless it was considered emblematic of the grain that it was expected would pass over the canal or be carried through the contemplated canal in the coming years. As you remember, Milwaukee has a building that's called the Grain Exchange. It's next to the Mitchell building, and it was built by Alexander Mitchell. And Milwaukee was the grain capital of the world, and I know you know that Milwaukee was the beer capital of the world at one time. And the price of grain throughout the world, the prices were set right here in Milwaukee in that grain exchange building. So it was a grain scoop that they were going to use for this groundbreaking. So when at last the auspicious moment arrived, Kilbourne, in anticipation of the severity of the labor to be performed, divested himself of his coat, standing before the assembled multitude, the very personification of a sinewy son of toil. He seized the treacherous scoop, placed its point upon the virgin soil, so soon to become historic, placed his foot upon its heel, and like the Indian upon the lake bluff, he gave the fatal thrust, and all was over. That is, with that scoop, it was over. It doubled up like a piece of tin. The look of mingled disappointment, mortification, rage, and disgust which came over the face of Mr. Kilbourne at this faux pas I shall never forget while life remains. He threw the treacherous and disabled scoop upon the ground with an exclamation that sounded like profanity to me. His assistant, however, quickly placed in his trembling hands a tool suitable for the work, with which the ground was at once broken. The wheelbarrow filled with earth, wheeled off, and deposited at the spot selected, after which the procession was reformed, marched to the old American building on the corner of 3rd and West Water Streets, and the celebration continued. As many of you know, Kilbourne was kind of a difficult fellow, and he was easily enraged, and most of the portraits you see of him show him to be quite a puss face. So that is exactly what happened in this description. So I thank you for your interest in local history, and I wish you a happy Memorial Day.
And what was your name again?
James Smith